bedraggled and ecstatic, we took the train into town and boarded the bus for Białowieża. It was our 7th pilgrimage to the village at the edge of the primeval forest where she lived. She had always lived there, 5 miles from the Belarusian border. She loved that forest as much as we loved her books, which, without a fraction of a second's hesitation, we would have laid down our lives to defend. We treated her every word as sacred, even though our whole task was to replace her every word. We arrived on September 20th, 2017. It was a new moon, but the stars of the northern hemisphere transformed her slim, sinuous home, converting the oak strips on the convex walls into quicksilver that momentarily held the frenzied shadows of the forest, slickening their inextricable shapes and then engulfed them. There were 8 of us. Swedish was new, handsome as a red deer, and we knew at first sight that he would be her favorite, not only because of the prestige of his language, a conduit to her inevitable Nobel Prize, but also because of his saunter, his stance, that gratifying invitation in his hot blue eyes. Because somehow, that evening, our author's unshakable husband, Bogdan, whose lust we believed worked like kerosene on her arboreal imagination, wasn't there. With Bogdan gone, she was different from how we'd ever seen her. She was ghost white. She remained immune to shadow, but her eyes were black holes, and it hurt to look into them directly, like we were being torn apart. So we kept our eyes on her crossed arms, but even her arms weren't her arms anymore exactly, more like twigs half inhumed by her too heavy, sludge-colored dress. Her neck lacked the onyx amulet she'd been given by her grandfather, the local black magician. Without it, her collarbone jutted out like it wanted to break. She didn't say much. She said nothing about Bogdan. We chalked up all these departures from our routine to the toll of finishing a magnum opus. We felt certain we could help her, not only because of Swedish, but also because we always had. Now we'd have to. Besides Bogdan, we were the only ones she truly trusted. If he was gone, that meant that all she had, was us. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I'm so glad that you chose that section to read from at the beginning. Is it translator's note or translator's warning that it's called?
Yeah, the very beginning is the translator's warning, as opposed to a note, just to kind of put you on edge as early as possible as you're reading.
And that brings us to something that I've really found fascinating and that I imagine must have been really difficult to pull off, which is that this is not just you writing a novel in English. It is a novel that is a fictionalized translation written by the Spanish language translator of Irena Rey, M.A. Wright, and then translated into English by Alexis. So can you tell me about that framing, that idea of creating a fictionalized translation, what that allowed you to explore, and maybe some of the challenges that it also brought to the table?
Yeah, so the book is narrated, supposedly these are true events, kind of like wild events that happen in this primeval forest, and they are being narrated for us by a translator from Argentina, who decided to write this book in Polish, not her native language, and then it's translated for us into English by her arch nemesis, Alexis from Arkansas. And I decided to do that because I thought it'd be funny, and also, so there's like a constant back and forth. There are translators' footnotes throughout, and Alexis is mostly just like insulting the narrator / fictional author, Emmy from Argentina, while Emmy is insulting Alexis in the main text. But I also, I wanted, part of writing this book had to do with pointing out the activity of translation and reminding readers that this is a really significant part of whatever they're reading. And so if we cannot trust the narrator or the translator, we're constantly being reminded of the power of the translator. So the translator is the person who has the final say over every word you're reading when you're reading international literature that was written in a language other than English. And so I just wanted to kind of make sure that that was something that people thought about all the time as they were reading this book.
I love that so much, and I love too that it allows you to kind of get into the fact that as translators we do actually have egos, we do make choices, we aren't just completely selfless, and often translation is portrayed in that way. It's just a kind of the selfless movement from one language to another. But I really love that you aren't afraid to show that a translator has an ego and can kind of take a little bit of ownership over a text, and that it's almost impossible not to leave some kind of a trace. There was a quote in the Times review of Irena Rey that stuck with me. The artist is a vampire, a cannibal, a consumer of everything and everyone, especially herself. So too are the translators, who are compromised, implicated, and out for blood, less an alliance of the faithful than a madding crowd. So can you tell me about how you came to kind of portraying the maybe darker, more selfish side of translation?
Yeah, I mean, this is partly just a component of the same sort of campaign that I really believe in. I think translators need more credit, but also need to recognize collaboration more broadly, even aside from translation. And I think it's also really important that writers get recognized for their original languages and cultures. Like, I don't want people to think that Olga Tokarczuk, for instance, is an English language writer. She doesn't want that, so I don't want that. She's a very proud Polish language author, and her whole literary tradition is part of everything she does. And so I think that's just like an essential reminder, particularly in the English-speaking world, that there is something outside of what we're familiar with, and we kind of need to reckon with that. And we need to also reckon with the fact that there's a human involved mediating that for us. And, of course, there are other humans involved. There's editors and everyone else who kind of participates in the production of a literary work. But in general, the translator is the person who decides on the words that are appearing on the page. And I forgot what else I was going to say. Something else that I
was
wanted
just
to...
going to ask if you have an ego.
Oh, if I have an ego.
No.
Well,
only if you wish.
yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to also treat translators with the respect that authors and artists in general get, right? So in terms of taking responsibility too as a translator, I do think it's inevitable that our politics leave their mark on the page, right? So there is no such thing as like an invisible or inaudible translator. That just doesn't exist, because we're human beings and we have our subjectivities and our stances. And even though we might try to simply follow in the footsteps of an author, every decision that we make is informed by our individual politics and our agendas, even if we're not consciously aware of those. So that is definitely also, something that I wanted to address.
That is a perfect segue into what I was hoping to talk about next, which is that Emmy and Alexis both have very different approaches to translation. Emmy believes that an author's words have to be really preserved, takes a more literal approach, and Alexis takes a more liberal one, sometimes even removing scenes if she feels that they don't work, if she believes that that is in service of the work in some way. And I think that the notion of whether a translation is faithful or not is one that gets tossed around a lot in reviewing. I love that you point out how political the act of the translator is, and I think, is it Emmy who says, yes, of Alexis, I knew what she really wanted was to civilize Irena's text exactly as you would expect a U.S. usurper to do. I think that's such a great and powerful moment. We talk about how you, in referring to these translators only by their languages initially rather than by their names, what that enabled you to experiment with in terms of their politics and kind of their power and in their different languages in the publishing marketplace in international literature? That was a very long question.
No, it's okay. I think it's about 10 questions, and we're gonna get to all of them, but I'm also
Please
gonna
take
turn
your
them
time.
around on you too. But,
I know, I'm really bringing out the big one.
yes. Just to start with the fact that the translators are initially referred to only by the languages into which they translate. This is also to show the character of the author, Irena Rey, the titular author, who actually is like not important to this book in any way, even though she's in the title. Like, all I wanted to do with Irena Rey is like get rid of her as quickly as I could. So she does disappear, but when she's there, she only sees the translators in terms of their utility to her, and that is through their language. And so American translator, US translator is referred to as English, Argentine translator is referred to as Spanish, etc. But yeah, so I knew from the very beginning of writing this book that I didn't want the main narrator to be from the United States, because I did want to think very carefully about the power dynamics between the different languages. And English is so powerful just economically, even aside from anything else. It's such an important language to get translated into. And so I wanted to think about what that does to the dynamics between the translators. And of course, Spanish is also a kind of hegemonic colonial language. And yet, I do think that there's a big difference between how the Spanish translations are perceived and the English language translations. And so Alexis is quite conceited and arrogant about her role in the publishing process. So she does talk about, just kind of like eliminating scenes if they don't serve her purpose, or just kind of constantly rewriting. But actually, so now I'm gonna turn the questions around. There is this spectrum between fidelity and freedom, and of course, we generally fall somewhere in the middle, not on either extreme, like Emmy and Alexis are. But I'm just curious, because you're also an editor, and I wonder if you have that temptation when you're translating books to edit out
them.
Yeah.
I do have that temptation.
Yeah, I do too. I'm satirizing it here, but yeah.
No, definitely. And I think it's much easier to grapple with that translation when you're working with a living author, and you can have those conversations with them when there are things that you feel might need to change or that you would like to suggest changes. When you're working with a dead author, that's much more difficult and murkier territory morally, I think.
So you've done that? You've suggested?
Yes.
And they took it well?
Yeah, well, I do. I'm lucky. I work with a lot of writers who are really fluent in English and will just read the final draft and give their sign off. So I feel like I can, either overtly suggest things or sneak things in, and they'll be aware of them. Yeah, what about you? Do you?
I don't think I have. I feel like this is a sentence by sentence struggle, though. And I'm also trying to always reflect on what my sense of style means and where it's coming from, because of course there are so many versions of style, and we kind of lose track of that in the US with our MFA programs and our conviction that we're telling stories correctly, which is really, really, really powerful here. I think I'm teaching also creative writing now, and I think it's just really hard to get out of that mentality. And I find that too when I'm translating. But one thing that we find as translators is mistakes that editors in the original languages miss. That happens all the time. Translators are often closer readers than editors, other than Lizzie, who I'm sure is the closest editorial reader who exists. But sometimes I'll point those out, but if it's not a mistake, I don't know. I don't remember having done that. I feel like people would be insulted. Okay, now imagining that my book is being translated, if a translator comes to me and says this whole scene is so stupid, can I please just delete it? How would I feel about that?
I've never done that, and I will never do that. But that is
Never say never.
I'm glad you mentioned because now you found out that your book is going to be translated into Spanish, which is a language you also write in and are fluent in and translate from. And we touched on this a little bit before we came over, but is that a process that you would like to be involved in, and what kind of involvement would you like to have?
Yeah, it's being translated into Spanish and Polish, which are the languages that are most involved in the book. So I think those are going to be very interesting experiments, particularly the Spanish, because so we have an Argentine narrator who has decided to write her book in a different language, but who is frequently kind of referring to her background. And in the meantime, her arch nemesis and translator Alexis is talking about how her Polish sucks, and you can kind of like sense the Spanish lurking underneath the Polish sentences. So the Spanish language translator of this book is from Spain, which is a very different kind of Spanish, which is discussed in the book. So I think it's going to be such a fun, creative process, because she's going to have to come up with a new frame narrative. Like, she's going to have to maybe like eliminate the original language text or eliminate the original narrator. Like, maybe the narrator is going to be, I don't know, like disappeared as well. She will have gone to somewhere without spoiling anything. But yeah, something has to have happened in order to justify a Spanish from Spain translation of this book. And then the Polish, yeah, I also have no idea what's going to happen with that. It's being translated into other languages too, but there's like there's like not as much of a puzzle in those.
Very cool. You mentioned the part of the book where, is it Alexis? No. Yes, Alexis is saying, angered by her efforts to forget it, of the narrator, angered by her efforts to forget it, the spirit of Spanish comes whooshing through the walls of every paragraph, breaking plates and continually flicking the light switch, creating an atmosphere of wrongness and scaring the shit out of everyone's dog. I really love that. But I'm wondering if Polish and Spanish come whooshing into your English paragraphs, if they affect your writing in English, your original writing as well.
Maybe. Maybe. You'll have to answer the question too. I mean, yeah, I think that whatever I'm currently working with is going to affect what I'm writing. And in this case, I did try to also make it sound like it was written by a person whose native language is Spanish. Sometimes I didn't want to bog it down too much in too many linguistic considerations. Like, if I really brought in Spanish and Polish to every word, I think it would get a little heavy. But I was writing it as this Argentine character, so I was definitely thinking in those terms for this particular project. But as someone who works also with Spanish a lot, is that something that influences your English language writing?
I don't think so. I've never written in Spanish, but I do agree that whatever I'm translating does affect my writing, because you really are embodying another style, and I think that seeps over into whatever you're producing too.
Yeah.
What did you do to when you were employing those tactics that you thought someone writing in Argentinian Spanish might have done in English? This is very difficult to phrase. What were some of the ways that you were thinking, okay, what would an Argentinian Spanish speaker write here in English?
I can't remember, because it was just kind of like all of it was, I wanted to make sure that all of it would be authentic to a person from Buenos Aires, which my person is.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there was anything like super overt. It was just all, I was trying to channel like, how my friends from Argentina would think and talk about things, and yeah.
Very fun. One thing else, other thing that I wanted to touch on apart from translation, which I know we could talk about forever, is the setting of the novel, which I feel plays such an important part. I have never been so fascinated by lichens and slime molds, and I'm curious about how you came to the primeval forest as a setting and what it offers symbolically. And the slime molds, please tell me more about the slime molds.
Yeah, so the place where this book is set is called Białowieża. It's a real forest and village that is really on the border between Poland and Belarus. It's the last remaining original so-called forest in Europe. I mean, that's part of, the reason why I wanted to set it there is largely that I love this place. I've been there a number of times, and I love it so much, and it's so powerful and wonderful, and it really needs to be protected. But also, there were a lot of terms that I was interested in interrogating. Original is certainly one of them. I think it's misleading to talk about purity in nature or anywhere else, perhaps, but human beings have been living in and around this forest for as long as the forest has existed. We just haven't completely destroyed it in the way that we have destroyed everywhere else, and then maybe replanted in Europe. So these are original old growth forests would probably be a more reasonable thing to call them. So I went there not for the first time, but in 2017 when there was a controversy happening with the government logging in the national park of this forest, Białowieża, and the excuse was that there was a spruce bark beetle infestation, but a lot of environmentalists argued that it actually had more to do with just the government wanted to make money by selling this timber, and also wanted to change the dynamics of the forest by planting oak trees rather than spruce, which would be more Polish supposedly, and whatever, more attractive or appealing to tourists in the future. And so I went to kind of explore what was going on and see just how extensive the damage was. And while I was there, I was talking to some national park workers about the creatures that I was seeing in the strict reserve, which is the most protected part of the national park. And there were slime molds, which is an interesting creature, and there were lichens, which are very interesting creatures. And then there was this one fungus in particular that I became very enamored of, called Fomus fomentarius. So it's this crazy looking thing that attaches to the trunk of a tree. It looks like a horse's hoof that has been cut off. So severed hoof that's just in the middle of a tree. And this guy was explaining to me that, so first of all, the fungus itself has a really interesting life story. So it starts its life as a parasite, and then so it kills its host tree. It preys upon sick trees and it kills them. But then once the tree is dead, it transforms into a decomposer, and it's really necessary to the whole forest ecosystem because it changes this tree into nutritionally rich soil that benefits everybody else in the forest. And that I thought was a useful metaphor for translation, potentially. And then this fungus actually was ubiquitously known to human beings for millennia because it was a fire starter. So before we had matches, this is how people would carry around parts of this fungus, and it catches sparks really easily. So you could create sparks with metal rods, and it would catch them and it would smolder. And so, in the middle of a snowstorm, you could start a fire, you could keep yourself warm, you could make food, etc. So it was really, really important to human beings for a really long time. And then it was over-harvested, it almost went extinct. We had matches, we didn't need it anymore. And now it's kind of coming back, actually, as a potential replacement for certain kinds of plastics and construction materials. So it's just an amazing, it can also replace leather, and it can be used to staunch wounds. Like, it's just an amazing animal. It's not an animal, it's a fungus. So yeah, there were just like so many creatures in the forest though that I discovered while I was there that I wanted to incorporate, and that I felt like this one in particular was a great parallel for translation.
I love that. I love that we as translators get to do all those things in like in metaphor. And speaking of that, I think you've become such an incredible advocate for translators, for getting translators' books, names on the covers of their books. Maybe the profession's unofficial spokesperson. This is shifting gears a bit, but what would you like to see in terms of the visibility of the translator in coming years?
Yeah, I mean, so one thing I definitely think is essential is to feature the translator's name on the cover of every translated book, again, for a variety of reasons. I think the translator's identity is really important and should be known by the reader. I think the language should also be there. Of course, we also need adequate pay. We really need royalties. It's very offensive to all of us that we are not currently necessarily receiving them. So an author gets like a cut of whatever they sell of their books. And it doesn't even make sense to me that translators wouldn't get that. It's such an incentive to, go out and promote the book, which we mostly do anyway. I mean, we're also like the English language representatives of our authors. So that would be a fundamental demand. What else do we demand?
I think those are good places to start. I think getting, sometimes, translation will be used sold into another, for audio rights maybe, or for TV or dramatic rights, and it's your translation that's being used, but you're never seeing any sort of compensation for that. I think that would be a really big step in the right direction as well. What else do we want?
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff like that. I mean, going back to the power of the English language translation, English translations are often used as bridge translations. So a number of translations of Olga Tokarczuk, for instance, are just translations of my translation. But I mean, there's like so much to unpack there. It isn't even just about me receiving compensation. So I don't know what to do about that. I would kind of shut it down if I had my way, but
just the whole idea of bridge translations in general. It is an odd thing.
Yeah.
Have you ever been part of a gathering of translators like the gathering of translators in this book?
Yeah, I mean,
except maybe not with not with quite the same ending.
Yeah, no crimes were committed in real life, but no, I mean, I think I was thinking about this in 2017 when I was in the forest, because I was just coming from a gathering of Olga Tokarczuk's very nice, real translators who are, such supportive and wonderful people, and really helped me with my translation of the books of Jacob. In terms of moral support, I mean, it's a 1,000-page historical epic, and also in terms of like research, people who had already finished their translations when I was kind of in the middle of mine were able to actually just like offer me page numbers and texts and so forth. And so as I got to know those people a little bit, I just kept thinking about this ego question, and thinking, having been to artist residencies and things like that, where people are really quite dramatic, and like there are always affairs, and there's always jealousy, and there's always so much going on, which was the opposite of my real life situation with these translators. But I just kept thinking like, well, what would happen if these are such smart, creative people, and we're all just talking about this one authorial figure, Olga? What would happen if we took her out of the equation? Could it be possible that, some drama would ensue? And, partly I put them in the forest for that reason, just like let them go wild.
What is your working relationship like with Olga?
Olga is really, really easy to work with. She's super supportive of her translators, but also once she's finished with a book, she just moves on. Like, she doesn't care anymore. She's on to the next experiment, and she's always like trying out some new genre or some new idea. So I think that's really helpful in terms of, you know, just like she lets things go. Once they're gone, and she kind of trusts her translators to carry on the torch. If you have questions, she's there, but she's not like wanting to oversee things in the way that Irena Rey does.
Sounds like an ideal author.
She is.
Do you have a dream translation project?
Well, yeah, thinking back to what we were talking about like the people we translate seeping into our own work. This is kind of, so when I finished translating Federico Falco's A Perfect Cemetery, I was so unwilling to part with the project that I started writing my own fiction in the spirit of, not in collaboration with, not in real collaboration with, like he was sent the stories, but he didn't like co-write them with me. But just trying to tap into the spirit that I loved so much about his work and continue it. So in a way, this book is, I mean, it's a continuation of so many different things, but one of them is a Polish/Argentine writer named Witold Gombrowicz, who lived in Argentina for 23 years, whose work I really love, who was recently retranslated. All of his books were just retranslated into English, so I feel like I'm never gonna get to do that. So here's this, like, that's the best I could do, the closest I could come.
And you said you shared the stories that you wrote with Federico Falco. How was that experience for him?
Good, I think good. He's very also like interested in English language short stories, and he is an editor as well, so he runs like a series of novellas that are published in Argentine Spanish, translated from the US. So yeah, he's a great person to kind of be in communication with about these things. And we've published other stuff that's more collaborative, like an interview and photographs and that kind of thing. And we have another book coming out of his in November called The Plains, which is really wonderful. So I hope that around, you know, that time we'll be doing more projects like that.
Lovely. I guess I would like to soon open it up for audience questions, but before that, can you tell us what you're reading right now, or what you think we should be reading right now?
That's a great question. I don't know what you should be reading right now. I'm not gonna talk about what I was reading on the plane here because I hated it, but I don't wanna, maybe you guys like it.
That really makes me want you to tell us what
I
it
wish I
is.
could, but I won't. No, I mean, if you're interested in any of the fungal things that I mentioned, or the slime mold or lichen things, if you haven't read Merlin Sheldrake's Entangled Life, it is brilliant and so beautiful. And also the audiobook is amazing. It's narrated by the author, and he has just such a beautiful narrative style. So yeah, if that interests you, Merlin Sheldrake, Entangled Life.
I see many people taking notes. Many people are
Yay,
excited.
that's a good, I love that book. What about you?
Oh no, am I reading anything that is not a manuscript submission right now?
Let's just talk about the manuscripts and like, who do you hate? Who do you like? Who are you gonna accept? Who are you gonna reject? How cruelly will you reject them?
I try not to be too cruel. I have to
Okay.
keep my karma up, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm reading right now. That's terrible.
It's always a hard question to answer.
I should have prepared. I knew this moment was coming. How are we on time, Annie? Is it okay for us to go to audience questions now?
Yeah, perfect timing.
We have a lovely audience full of friends.
I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
Since this book sounds like it's mostly about the intellectual exercise of translation, how was it for you to I haven't read it yet, but it sounds like there's sort of a mystery plot going on, so how was it to try and have that starting point of like the intellectual exercise, but then so applied into it?
I wasn't really thinking of it as an intellectual exercise so much as an emotional one in this case. I mean, there is certainly like the intellectual problem of what do we owe the original author and the original text, and what do we owe our target language readers, etc. There's like that overhanging everything, but I also wanted all of these people to be somehow emotionally dependent upon this author. So the narrator sees in her a kind of quasi-divine, but mostly maternal figure. And so her sudden disappearance leaves this massive void. And then she has to like go in search of a replacement. There's this other figure of Alexis who is kind of like occupying the place of the author increasingly as the book goes on, but to whom the narrator is like attracted, but also she's repulsed by her. So yeah, it didn't feel so much like an intellectual exercise, because basically like once I created the characters and put them in this place, Białowieża Forest, I don't know, obviously this isn't the case, but it really felt like they took on all of their own kind of desires, and I just sort of followed them. I wrote most of the book at our residency in Switzerland in the fall of 2020. I think I was like not legally allowed to go from the United States to Switzerland. I was like quasi-arrested in Frankfurt at the airport. But somehow, for some reason, I think they just got frustrated with me and let me go. But I was like the only person at this residency in Switzerland, which was great because it was a beautiful place. And I was in isolation, and I could just like live with these insane characters that I had created, and they just kind of dictated the rest.
When it comes to like translating stuff, how much of it is like an argument with yourself or whatnot to when it comes, or like is the stuff in footnotes where when it comes to like figures of speech, and how do you translate those? Do you find an equivalent in English, or do you translate it more literally and then add a footnote explaining it? Or is it kind of a mix of the two depending on the situation?
Sure.
I think that's a really fun puzzle of translation, actually. And I like to try to invent something if I can, or find an equivalent. I would much rather do that than do a literal translation, although sometimes being literal can stretch the English in interesting ways. But I think, yeah, that's usually a fun opportunity to get creative and see what happens.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. It just depends on, the project and like the exact moment in the project, but yeah, exactly the same.
Hi, I'm really enjoying this discussion. I admit I haven't read the book yet, but the whole thing is reminding me, or bringing to mind, just the gestalt of mediation in general, and how nothing is really in a vacuum. It comes through a person's experience or imagination in the first place, and then it gets touched by so much. I mean, even the example you gave with the fungus on the tree is mediating the life of the tree. I don't know, so I'm just thinking about mediation, and I wonder if that's something either of you think of in general, or how it applies in your work.
Yeah, all the time. I think that's such a great, I'm glad you brought up the word mediation. I think that's a really lovely noun for describing what the act of translation can be. A kind of negotiation, a kind of channeling, something between the two. But also, I think, as you point out, Jenny, that, we can never really escape our own impulses as writers or as readers when we are translating. So as much as we might try to be absent from the process who will inevitably emerge into it in some way. And I like that mediation hints at that emergence, you know?
And media.
Yeah, and the media, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, also, I wanna go back to editing on this one too, cause like thinking about my experience with my editor of this book, who maybe not coincidentally quit publishing entirely a couple of weeks ago. But, you know, like so he changed so much about this book. The title is his title. Titles are always slightly separate from the text, but he changed, I mean, so basically like the first half of the novel is more or less what I sent him when I submitted the manuscript. And then somewhere around that middle point, he just had like a whole different vision for the book. And so we had to work really closely and carefully together. We had a ton of arguments about what to do with it. And I found that like so helpful and productive. I loved that. I had never had that many fights with an editor before. I'm sorry he quit publishing.
Didn't know he quit publishing.
Yeah, he did. He's actually my fourth editor in a row to quit publishing.
It's not you. It's publishing.
Yeah, the other three were at the same catapult, and that's not me. So anyway, but do you think that, I kind of also feel like the editors should be named, there should be like a title page.
You do that in the UK.
Not
It's fancy.
always.
Sometimes. Once or twice.
I've definitely done it at least twice. But I think that would be great, because I feel like, and you know, Daniel is not the only person who had a big impact on this book. Also, my agent edited it. Daniel's editorial assistant had a big part in it. So all of those names, I think, should be there, because all of that really dramatically changed the landscape of the book. But as an editor, how do you feel about that?
I love that you point out how collaborative the process of bookmaking actually is, because I think so often we think of a book as the work of a singular literary genius, and it isn't usually that. There are whole teams that go into it. Many of my former colleagues are here and would, you know, made the publication of the books that we all worked on together possible. And so I think the more acknowledgement of that kind of symbiotic relationship that can be done, the better for the industry as a whole, I think, and the preservation of its employees, and you know, so your editors stay in the business a little longer, maybe. But yes, definitely a very collaborative thing. Other audience questions? Yes.
I have a question for you, more about your relationship with different genres. So like I know Homesick was, I believe, just a memoir, or marketed as a memoir in the US, and more of a novel in the UK. And this, you know, seems to have crime fiction elements maybe. Do you just love all genres? Is there a sci-fi book coming next?
I wish that were the case. Yeah, so I thought my first book was a novel, and then the US publisher didn't think so. So it was sold as a memoir. I guess I feel like I don't care so much about the genre boundaries or like media boundaries. So I also incorporate photographs into my writing, and I would be happy to incorporate other art forms as well. I think kind of the more the merrier, you know, within reason. I really read literary fiction like obsessively, and that's what I consume in terms of literature. But I'm sure other elements are seeping in always, you know, as a result of like everything else in popular culture that I'm seeing and hearing about and so forth. Yeah, if you have a science fiction idea for me, let me know afterwards. I'll give you a cut.
Was marketed as fiction in Spanish?
Yeah, it was definitely, so I wrote this book in Spanish as a way partly of, this microphone is in and out, right? I'm not sure what's going on with that, but,
We hear you.
you want me to hit it?
So just like wiggle the bottom.
Wiggle the bottom.
There you go.
I wrote, thank you, I wrote my first book as a way of kind of integrating more fully into the local literary community where I was living. And I had been particularly struck by how authors that I was translating from Argentina were making themselves kind of vulnerable in their semi-autobiographical novels or autofiction, whatever you would want to call it. But there was never any conversation there about, like, is this a memoir or is this a novel? It was just a novel. It was like whatever the author says it is what it is. And it's kind of easier to talk about if it's a novel in some ways. And so I just assumed that was what I was doing. But then, yeah.
And then the U.S. usurped.
Yes.
everything again.
Yeah. But that's a great, I love the thinking about genre and media, but also never think about it at the same time.
Others.
Okay, so I'm not a translator, and so when you're, and I also have not read the book, so when you're talking about the different, like, journey that a certain sentence travels between languages and how that, like, changes, can you, like, explain an example from the book about, like, how that works? Because I'm interested.
Do you have thoughts? So you mean like, as we're translating and transforming a sentence, how that changes the,
Like, I think someone asked a question maybe that was a little bit similar, but just sort of like, what does it mean for someone who is like, I think the example was like Argentinian to translate something, like how would it sound different? Or like how did you as a writer, like did you first write it in that language and then translate it into English or?
I didn't write the whole thing in Spanish. I just, like I say, I was just trying to, I felt like I was, enough this character that I could sort of see how she was seeing the world, and it was through this mediation of the Argentine Spanish that I know. And so that would be reflected, I guess, sometimes in her vocabulary, sometimes, there are obviously a lot of overlaps between English and Spanish, a lot of cognates, a lot of false cognates, and then there's a lot of syntax, like the word order and just the things that are prioritized in one language are often different from the things that are prioritized in another. The punctuation is different. So many things are different in ways that can be retained if you're trying to reflect difference without losing comprehension on the part of the reader. So yeah, I was trying to think of accessible ways to show who she is through language, while also remembering that she's being translated from a different language by her arch nemesis.
Excuse me, our daughter is a translator, and she spoke here about a month ago or so.
Oh,
And she talked about the
wonderful.
importance of music and language, that was a tie that really got her into translating. You may know her, Angela Roto.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, she.
Oh, that's so
she
great.
told us to come.
Congratulations to her.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And she talked about the importance of music for her anyhow, and I'm not sure I can explain it, there's a lot of things that I don't understand that she's talking. Yeah.
Musicians. Oh, I used to be. I think about the music in translation a lot. I think that I'm really drawn to projects where I get to try to play with sound in an interesting way and really try to retain that in the English when possible. And if not possible, then try to create a different kind of music, and that's really fun. Your daughter is based here in Minneapolis?
Sofia, Bulgaria.
Oh, I was
Yeah.
gonna say I want to befriend her, but I still have to go to Bulgaria.
Yeah, I'm not a musician, I wish I were, but I do think about rhythm all the time when I'm working in prose. And that's one reason why I feel like it's so important to have recently lived in the place that you're translating from or live there currently. So I really only translate Spanish from Argentina because that's where I lived for a long time. And I feel like I have that rhythm down, like I know what that sounds like, and that's so important, I think, in, really good prose. You could write prose without that, AI could produce that, and you could kind of get the gist of something, but it would lose like a lot of the pleasure that you might derive from a different kind of rhythm. And like Olga Tokarczuk's rhythm is very kind of soothing, especially when she's talking about something really troubling, and that's like a really interesting tension that I love. Or like everyone I translate, I think about that rhythm, as well as the sound that Lizzie's talking about. So yeah, I think that's definitely such a huge part of translation.
You read your translations out loud at the end.
If I am feeling like a good translator, then I definitely, I think I try to read, as much as possible out loud, whether it's my own work or a translation, because that's really the only way to perfect it, whatever that means.
Ooh, 2 questions.
I find it so interesting that even when you sit down to write your own novel, you imagine that you're a translator and that you're translating somebody. So I was just wanted to ask about the different experience of translating and writing your own original text, and even on the most basic level, how do you divide your day between the two? When do you work on one or the other, and how do you set yourself differently to do this kind of work?
I think that the psychoanalyzing version of my friend will be satisfied with the following answer. It has more to do with me wanting to be an Argentine novelist than it has to do with translation. Like, this is a book that does have to do with the ideas and the intellectual exercise of translation, or like the political commitment that I have made to translator visibility. But I think really it has more to do with just my feeling of belonging to a different literary community or culture. Even though I'm now living in the United States, I still hope to return to Buenos Aires, and I may still someday be an Argentine novelist. And this was like a way of accessing that, probably.
So before you said how since you lived in Argentina, how you're much more comfortable translating those, have you ever translated a different Spanish, like a different author who wasn't from Argentina, who was from Spain or Brazil or Mexico? Because I know the Spanish language has such variety, depending on what region you're in. And so did you run into, have you done that? And if so, did you run into any complications then where it was, I guess there was a bit of, not necessarily a hurdle, but a mental shift that you had to make because it wasn't Argentinian Spanish?
Yeah, I have only even tried once. Otherwise, I've looked at things, and I just feel like it's imagine if someone were translating me and you've just heard me speak versus someone from Glasgow or something. It's really so different. I translated kind of as a favor to an Argentine friend a piece of flash fiction by an author from Ecuador, but had been edited by my Argentine friend. I mean, it was literally a page and a half. That's actually the only thing that I've ever translated from Spanish that wasn't from Argentina. And I have translated Argentine writers who are not from Buenos Aires, although they live in Buenos Aires, and I have been to the province that they're from. I would be interested in expanding that, but maybe more as an excuse to travel around Argentina. but you translate more expansively.
Yeah, but sometimes it feels wrong. I mean, I was living in Spain and translating a Colombian writer, and that was just such an odd experience. And then I moved back to the US and started translating a Spanish writer, and it was all very confusing. But I think I do agree. Obviously, the ideal is to have spent a very long time in a place and be able to accurately render that place in another language. I felt like I was a bad translator that time.
Definitely not a bad translator, thanks.
Well, if there's one more, we have time, but if there's not, then we can sign some books.
Yeah, that's good.
Win!
Yeah. Right. I was wondering what conditions need to be met where you feel that your translation is precise in terms of voice or style. Is it something that's just instinctive? Is it something that's technical? How do you know when it feels right?
Such a good question that I will let Jenny answer.
I mean, I like the word instinctive. I do think there's like an instinctive or even like mystical aspect to translation that underlies the intellectual. Yeah, I think like in terms of, what is voice is a really difficult question for anyone who is reading or writing, and it is also the most important question in fiction. So yeah, identifying that, capturing that, and conveying that is, I think it would be really hard for anyone to articulate exactly how that's happening, just as it would be hard for an author to kind of concisely describe the voice of the book or their voice, if they feel that that's the same across different works. I don't think I've ever heard anyone do that. Have you?
I don't think so. I think I had one teacher who used to say that the translation should be a convincing work of art in English, but I really started to question that in recent years, because convincing to whom and, by what standards? I think it feels more about, I don't know, I feel like that's not true enough to the work to say that it needs to be convincing in English. What do you think of the word convincing?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what that means.
Yeah. I like this instinctual idea. Sometimes I light some candles and pretend I'm doing a seance when I'm translating.
Yeah, that sounds good.
If not convincing, what are you leaning more towards in recent years to what translation feels to you?
I guess I think of it as the most intimate form of reading, and I want to get as close to the original as I can.
I mean,
in my
Yeah, go ahead.
translation. Yeah.
I guess another question or another way of thinking about it would be like, what do we look for when we're reading a translation, or judging a translation, which I do a lot, like on book competitions. I mean, I think ideally there's a harmony, if not a unity, in how things are being narrated. And again, I'm referring to fiction. And so, yeah, that remains a little bit elusive, but there's not constant clashes. And the thing that I was reading on the plane was just, like one sentence that was from this place in this time period, and then the next sentence is from this other place in this other time period, and then the next sentence is from no place and no time period. So that doesn't make sense, right? We know what I think it's easier to identify what a bad book is than to say what a good book is, whether it's a translation or not. So this is a bad translation. So maybe that suggests, that a good translation has to do with harmony, and, coherence. We're getting on time's up.
All right.
Leave it on harmony.
Yeah.
All right, well,
thank you both so much.
Thank you so much.
I was just thinking when I was riding on my way here. Like, I wasn't texting this, so he didn't use the if you heard of it.
I know.
That's like just into the face, it's called Mud.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh, I kind of want to see it then.
Yeah.
Would you want to see it with me?
Yeah.
Okay, wait. Let me see, because I think it's only in like a dollar store. Oh my god! I'm so happy to see you.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen you
Yeah.
for so long.
You were home. Really?
No.
No.
It feels like
It's
that
been
long.
a long
You're
time. I was
taller.
trying to think.